It has been argued that the British military was in hot action every single day of Queen Victoria's more than 60-year reign. And while that's difficult to prove, it certainly wouldn't be surprising. The British Empire at the time was the largest and most far flung in history, and conflict could occur anywhere in that empire. There were, put simply, quite a large number of what have been called Queen Victoria's little wars. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 might have been the littlest of all, and yet the war that is recognized by Guinness as the shortest in world history illustrated the constant challenges of empire. The East African island, or actually archipelago, of Zanzibar is today part of a political union making up the nation of Tanzania. It covers an area of about 950 square miles and has a population of about 1.9 million. Its location has historically made it a center of trade between Arabia, India, and Africa. Zanzibar produces a number of spices, including cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and black pepper, thus earning the regionally used moniker the Spice Islands. However, trade also included ivory, ebony, gold, and slaves taken from the mainland. The island was largely converted to Islam somewhere in the 10th or 11th century. The first known European contact was Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama in 1498, and in 1503 or 1504, Portuguese captain Rui Lourenço Ravasco Marques demanded tribute from the local rulers, making Zanzibar a part of the Portuguese Empire. The relationship between the empire and the local population seems to have been distant but friendly. Portuguese missionaries attempted to convert the population to Roman Catholicism, apparently with little success. In 1698, the Portuguese were expelled, and the island fell under the influence of the Sultanate of Oman. The island became so wealthy with the development of spice plantations and a large slave trade. Slaves imported from the mainland were used both in the local plantations and sold in Arabia, the Ottoman Empire, and Egypt. That Sultan Said bin Sultan al Busaidi moved his capital from Muscat, Oman, to the Zanzibar city of Stonetown in 1840. In 1858, a succession crisis separated Oman and Zanzibar into separate principalities, and the archipelago was ruled by its own sultan. But Zanzibar became a part of the colonial conflict between the expanding German and British empires. Starting in 1822, the British signed a series of treaties with the Sultan, coerced by a threat of blockade, intended to end the Zanzibar slave trade. There were also British commercial interests in Zanzibar, as well as strategic interests as a naval base and a way to limit German ambitions in East Africa. British influence grew, and in 1890 a new sultan agreed to make Zanzibar a British protectorate, and in the agreement agreed that the British would be allowed to veto any future appointment of a new sultan. The British understood the importance of keeping a pro-British sultan to counter influence from Germany, although there was some local resistance to the British efforts to eradicate the lucrative slave trade. A British diplomat explained, to the promoters of the colonial movement in Germany, Zanzibar, as the metropolis emporium of East Africa, appeared to be the all-important key position. In 1893, the Sultan was a man named Barash, described by a British source as an enlightened ruler who visited England, acquired steamships to develop communications, and greatly extended his dominions on the mainland. Barash had supported British efforts to eradicate the slave trade, but British influence had its limits. British diplomat James Rennell Rodd, the consul general, noted many problems. Our field of social and economic action was, moreover, severely restricted by the existence of ancient treaties with Muscat, which conferred upon foreign subjects residents in Zanzibar the privileges, immunities, and independence of local jurisdiction, which are enjoyed under capitulations in Oriental countries. Rodd wrote it was impossible not to feel considerable sympathy for the Sultan, as pressure was continually exercised upon him by the dominant Arab class to oppose the innovations and reforms which the protectorate regime had rendered inevitable. They foresaw the ultimate end of domestic slavery also with the process of time, and believed that without the labor which it ensured, the gathering of the clove crop would be impossible. Against the Arab class, the British only wielded so much influence, with Rod complaining this little group of Englishmen, acting under the much-abused Foreign Office and using native and in a few cases Indian instruments, held on tenaciously to a precarious position in East Africa with no material force behind them except for the 2 or 3 light cruisers or gunboats on the station. The Foreign Office seemed willing to use those ships when necessary. Thus a new difficulty arose when it became clear that the Sultan was dying of what Rod described as dropsy, which is usually a sign of an underlying illness. This raised the question of the successor for the pro-British Sultan. Rod described the situation. The general rule in Mohammedan countries is that the eldest member of the reigning family should succeed, but here the accepted practice has not been strictly followed. An elder brother of the reigning sultan, the next in age to the famous Sultan Barga, had been twice passed over. And the sanction lay in the submission of the people and the acceptance of the ruler by the powerful Arab families. This was practically tantamount to the principle of the longest sword, which appeared to be a Muscat tradition. The candidate with the longest sword would evidently be the one supported by the protecting power. That is to say, while the British claimed authority to veto the appointment of a new sultan, the decision ultimately had to be accepted by the people and approved by the leading trading families. Among the possible claimants was the son of the current sultan, Khaled, who Rod described as a rather truculent youth of 18. Khaled's claim was weakened by his youth, but Rod noted that as the son of Bagha, he would have his supporters. He was, however, Rod wrote, for other reasons, undesirable. Instead, Rod preferred Hamad bin Twain, the son of a brother of Barga, now dead, a man of about 40, of reputed high character and a student of Arab literature. As the Sultan's condition worsened, Rod set up a signalman who could quickly alert the consul if he passed, hoping to be able to turn away any quick efforts to replace Barga with Khalid. The plan was almost foiled, however. On March 5, 1893, the Sultan died. Rod collected a force of Royal Marines and sailors, but when they arrived at the palace, Khalid had already been admitted by the dead Sultan's sister through a back entrance into the palace and was actually in possession of the palace. Rod managed to take control with the support of the Royal Marines and their machine guns. When Khalid closed the palace doors, Rod threatened to blow them down. They forced the doors, and Rod writes, "For a moment it looked as if the staircase would be held against us, but the sight of the Marines brought wisdom." Hamad was duly installed as Sultan, although Rod only did so provided he would agree to my conditions. Those had all been carefully thought out and prepared in advance. The conditions, which Rod said were of a nature to define more precisely the situation created by the Protectorate and laid down clearly what was to be left to the administration with special provisions regulating domestic slavery, were quickly accepted, and Rod writes, "The new Sultan was solemnly proclaimed amid the acclamations of the crowd." Rod congratulated himself on his action, which he claims prevented the rival claimants from settling the issue by force of arms. Rod was happy with his choice, writing, "Nothing could have been more satisfactory than the attitude of the new Sultan in those early days. He made a public declaration to his Arab subjects to the effect that he was completely at one with the protecting power." However, Rod's actions might not have been as successful as he imagined. 3 years later, Sultan Hamad died suddenly on August 25, 1896. Historic UK explains, although the truth will never be fully known about the causes for his death, it is widely believed that his cousin Khalid had him poisoned. The British Consul General was Sir Basil Cave, and informed by Rod's actions 3 years previously, he tried to move to ensure that Khalid did not succeed to the throne. But the situation was not resolved as easily as it was 3 years previously. Military historian Ian Hernan wrote in his 2000 book The Savage Empire, Wars of the 19th Century, "It can never be proved conclusively that Khalid murdered his kinsman, but he quickly took command of 1,200 of the late Sultan's troops and seized the palace with the obvious intention of proclaiming himself the new Sultan." The London Standard wrote that he did so quickly after the breath was out of the late Sultan's body as to prove clearly that he had made elaborate preparations for the event. Cave tried to warn Khalid to think carefully about his actions, but he continued to gather forces, eventually drawing 2,500 men armed with both cannons and Maxim machine guns that had been gifts by the British and Germans to the previous Sultan. It seems that Khalid had also learned something from Rod's actions, and his was not a situation that would be solved by 200 sailors and marines. Khalid proclaimed himself Sultan at 3 in the afternoon, which of course Cave didn't recognize, but he had cabled the Foreign Office and waited for more instruction before taking action. The protected cruiser HMS Philomel, with a crew complement of 220 and mounting 120mm guns, as well as the gunboat HMS Thrush, were in the harbor. And a second gunboat, HMS Sparrow, arrived in the evening, and another protected cruiser, HMS Raccoon, the next morning. The naval force was then significantly reinforced when, by coincidence, the first-class cruiser HMS St. George, flagship of Rear Admiral Henry Rawson, commander of the Cape and East Africa Station, arrived in the early afternoon. Now, with a significant naval force behind him, Cave received a telegram from the Home Office. "You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's government. Do not, however, attempt to take any action which you are not certain of being able to accomplish successfully." With authority in hand, Cave sent an ultimatum. The New York Times wrote, "This evening an ultimatum was sent to Saeed Khalid, informing that unless he strikes his flag and makes a complete surrender by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the palace will be bombarded. Khalid apparently didn't take the threat seriously, despite assurances from Cave that we do not want to open fire, but unless you do as you are told, we certainly shall do so. Hernan writes, 2 minutes after the hour, raccoon, thrush, and sparrow opened fire simultaneously. It was no great stone citadel, but a flimsy wooden structure made up of spindly wooden balconies and verandas. The impact of high explosives and shell splinters upon the 3,000 defenders and servants packed inside the palace's narrow alleys and courtyards and behind hastily erected barricades of baled goods, crates, and bags of rubber is all too easy to imagine. A small defense came from the royal yacht, the Glasgow, when it fired on the St. George with cannon that had, ironically, been a gift to the Sultan from Queen Victoria. The boat was quickly sunk. Historic UK writes, by 9:40 the shelling had ceased, the Sultan's flag pulled down, and the shortest war in history had officially ended after only 38 minutes. Some 500 of Khalid's men had been killed, to a loss of only one British sailor wounded. Khalid himself, though, had fled. Hernan quoted a newspaperman who was there. Khalid, in spite of him saying that he would rather die in the palace than leave it, fled at the first shot with all the leading Arabs, who left their slaves and followers to carry on the fighting. A new sultan, even more indebted to the British, was duly installed the same day. Hernan writes, the British could have abolished the sultanate and created a crown colony, but they didn't want the expense of running a direct administration. They chose instead to keep the sultan as a figurehead while tightening their control on all military, financial, and executive affairs. Hernan writes that Zanzibar's townspeople had largely stayed loyal, and the newspapers in England supported the action. The London Standard wrote that it is satisfactory to be able to announce this morning that the crisis in Zanzibar no longer exists. It has been solved by the prompt and successful intervention of the British men of war. As to the casualties, unfortunately Khalid had not been ousted from the palace without considerable loss of life. For this bloodshed, he and he alone must bear the responsibility and the blame. Both Cave and Rawson were knighted for the action. Khalid managed to escape to the German embassy and eventually to German East Africa, although he was eventually captured by the British in 1916 and sent into exile. Zanzibar remained a British protectorate until the British government granted independence in 1963, and immediately thereafter there was a revolution that overthrew the Arab elite that had dominated the islands for centuries. As with much of the colonial era, the conflict can't easily be divided into who was right and who was wrong. Khalid was operating in his own interests as much as the British were, and the interests of the general public were hardly a concern for either. The Sioux City, Iowa Journal noted that the action raised little interest even in Europe. The reason, they argue, is because Zanzibar has no friends, and the British can do about as they please without any danger of interference from any source. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop, book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.